I'm Professor Stephen Dyson, and I'm totally disoriented by this new world of AI. Maybe like you, I thought of robots when I thought of them at all, largely in the register of science fiction.
I'm Professor Jeff Dudas, and I'm lost too. I thought that maybe the impact of AI would be to replace heavy or semi-skilled labor. Neither of us imagined that we would live to see AI that generated human-level written work instantly and cheaply. I never thought that my job as a worker in the knowledge class of ideas might itself be on the chopping block.
Until November 30th, 2022.
In the world of artificial intelligence, there's been one name that's been on everyone's lips lately.
ChatGPT.
ChatGPT.
ChatGPT is technology accessible and free to anyone on the web that impersonates what it's read on the internet. Type in a request and it can write legal documents, software, even school essays.
We are not professors of computing or experts in the area of AI, but we do know about stories, the tales that we tell ourselves to understand what's happening in our lives.
And we want to go on a journey to explain how AI, especially conversational AI like ChatGPT, is reshaping intimacy, work, our politics, and our future. And we want to do this by exploring popular storytelling about these new technologies.
AI is new and shocking. When we encounter something new, we try to understand it by likening it to something else. Something that we're more familiar with, something that we already understand. These metaphors are the basic stories that we tell. This thing is like this other thing. Metaphors are all over our thinking about AI. We pair ideas, the human and the computer, the robot and the slave, the large language model and the personal assistant, the friend and the chatbot. Metaphors can clarify things, but they can also confuse us. Where is the boundary between being like something else and something actually crossing over and becoming the thing? Who sets these boundaries? Who helps us when the lines become blurred and we start tripping over them?
Today, we start our journey toward answering these questions, and we start in the past, because it turns out humans have been imagining something like AI for a long time now. It's a big story, and so we break it into the smallest pieces that we can. In computing, these are called bits. And so today we have a story in 3 bits. Bit 1, Turing. Bit 2, Rossum. Bit 3, slaves. Bit 1, Turing. Can machines think? In 1950, the British mathematician Alan Turing asked this question in his seminal paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. His ideas would dominate the thinking on artificial intelligence for the next 75 years. Turing realized almost immediately that he'd argued himself into a corner. Can machines think is an unanswerable question. What is thinking? So he decided to invent a game. The goal of this game was to convince players that they were talking to another person, when in fact they were talking to a machine. He called this the imitation game.
Making machines that look like people is beyond us today, let alone in 1950. So Turing said that the game would be played blind. Players would communicate via text with an unseen other. This might be another person, or it might be a computer. The player would submit questions. The unseen other would answer them. To fool the human player into thinking that they were talking with another human being, the machine would need to respond with the fluency and the manners of a person. The goal of this AI was not thinking, it was deception. Turing had in mind what we call chatbots, machines able to hold convincing conversations with humans. In 1950, Turing asked, "Are there imaginable digital computers that would do well in this imitation game?" Today, the answer is yes.
ChatGPT came as such a shock because it showed machines easily passing the Turing test. Jeff and I wanted to reread Turing's paper and rethink his test in light of this new reality. We started by asking why Turing ran away from his original question: can machines think? Turing is often taken, or the Turing test is often taken as an answer to that question, can machines think? But Turing is actually, perfectly transparent and in fact at pains to stress that can machines think is fundamentally the wrong question, right? It is in fact a question he calls in the paper so meaningless as to not deserve discussion. Why do you think he thinks it's a meaningless question?
I think what he is trying to say, and at least this is what I read sort of between the lines in his analysis, is that What actually matters is what human beings do with machines and the way in which human beings interact with machines. So what matters is not the subjective consciousness, potential subjective consciousness of a machine, but rather the subjective consciousness of human beings. That's what matters. That's what meaning accrues from. And so this is the appropriate question. The focus is not on the capacity of the machine, except in relation to its ability to persuade a human being.
Yeah, so I think that's part of it. That's definitely one way to take what he's saying. I think there's another way that he comes at this. I read him as saying that can machines think is an unimportant question because it's unanswerable. I don't read him as ruling out that the machine could actually be doing something that any reasonable observer would regard as thinking. And I think at points in the paper, he actually makes the point that machines that fool us through the imitation game may be so complex or unknowable to us that they're doing things that even their programmers and engineers can't quite understand how they're coming up with those answers, which really resonates with modern large language models and things like ChatGPT, which have generative or emergent capacities that even their engineers are saying, well, this seems to work, but we can't actually describe how it came up with this answer. I think he's relying on something that's very familiar to people in the humanities, which is the other minds problem. And I think, as I read the paper, he says at one point, there will be an objection to a positive result to the Turing test, right? A result that says, this machine has fooled us, and therefore that machine is thinking, the strongest possible result you could get from a Turing test. And the objection will be, well, but it can't think because it doesn't have a consciousness or it doesn't have a soul. And we know that things that think have consciousness and soul. They're not just algorithms or as Turing was probably thinking, kind of mechanical gears and electrical impulses. And the other minds problem, as I understand it, is the difficulty you have that, I know I'm thinking. I can feel, I have the embodied experience of thinking. I know my inner thoughts. I know the process. It turns out I actually don't because of, more contemporary findings in psychology. But I believe I know why I'm reaching conclusions and all the rest of it. I don't know that you're thinking. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming you're thinking because I think we're kind of biologically similar and you behave as if you're thinking. But I only actually have access to my thinking and my thinking processes. So how do I know that you're not a figment of my imagination and I'm projecting my thought process on you, or B, you are thinking, but you're doing it in a totally different alien way than what I'm doing. And it is ultimately unknowable, right? The other mind's problem is you only have access to your own mind. You're guessing about everyone else's mind. And at one point, several points in computing machinery and intelligence, I think Turing relies on the other mind's problem to say, that machine, you can't possibly know what process it's going through. And you can't say it's not thinking any more than you can say another human being is or is not thinking.
We then turned to a key point about the Turing test, that it is a test of the ability to lie. The seminal test for AI is its ability to fool us, perhaps even to make fools of us.
Turing deliberately sets up his test as one, not of cognition, but of deception. That's surely crucial, right? In a world where we are concerned about the influence of conversational AI from a number of vectors, like, is it going to cause people to have relationships that are human-like with things that are fundamentally not human? And that's going to be unfulfilling or disappoint them. We're college professors. What is the future of education when totally plausible, including plausibly bad, college essays can be written by conversational AI in 2 seconds and be essentially non-detectable? What is a society like where most decisions about your future, your employment, your credit rating, your insurance, law enforcement are made by algorithms that even the people who are employing them, perhaps especially the people who are employing them, cannot tell you how they reach the decisions. They just tell you, I'm sorry, Jeff, you're a flight risk, you're not getting bail, or you're not getting that job. It surely matters that Turing sets off this discussion in the register or on the footing of not good faith cognition, but actual deception.
Deception pointing towards the possibility of apocalyptic outcome. I think that's a really good and sharp point as well. And One of the things that's going to be interesting to me to think through as we kind of do this multi-year journey with this series is whether there's something specifically cultural and time-bound with regard to this, to our tendency, sort of what we might call Western Hemisphere at least, tendency to imagine machines in the register of deception, to imagine AI in the register of apocalyptic outcome, rather than either neutral or, perhaps in the realm of some kind of paradisal or utopian potential. And I'm going to wonder how constant that theme is over the course of human history. Is it specific to our current time and place? Does it have roots in our near history? And how does all of it reflect upon this, what appears to be a bone-deep fear that human beings have frequently voiced, that the things that we make might come to dominate us?
Yeah, and I think that as we go on this journey, we're going to have to look deep into the historical past for all sorts of reasons. The roots of AI, both as a technical phenomena or specifically as a technical phenomena, for some metaphors from history that might be helpful to us in avoiding dangers and seizing opportunities. But also we're going to have to look at the roots of cultural perceptions of AI and a very broad definition of AI. And I think we're both very interested in some of the extremely old conceptions of things like automatons or kind of homunculus, artificially grown persons, and the degree to which, as you say, the fear of those things kind of rising up and dominating us. The thing that you build or create to be a useful tool actually being so useful that it's more useful than you are and it's fully aware of its own usefulness, and it comes to displace you and so forth. We started to think about the things Turing had anticipated in 1950 and what he'd missed. The internet and a text-based world. Yeah. So this was another thought I had when I was reading Turing's paper, for a couple of different reasons. Turing, of course, could not have conceived of something like the internet. And I think it enters his story, but I think it enters his story in a number of different ways. One is he's very keen to state that his form of artificial intelligence is going to try and interact with us through a text-based medium. So he excludes from the Turing test things like, robots that are supposed to look like people or genetically engineered clones that would presumably look exactly like people. He's not interested in physical manipulations of the world or physical interactions. He's interested in text-based or text-mediated interactions with humans and how plausible those are to humans. That, I think, would have read differently and perhaps less dangerously in 1951 than it does today, because what does the internet do? Except it transfers huge realms of human activity out of the register of direct physical manipulation and into what is effectively text or text analog, text adjacent mediums. Because we know that obviously the internet starts out as a purely text-based, medium and is still kind of text dominant. But we know from the capacities of contemporary large language mediums large language models, that they are now kind of multimodal, or they can handle more than text. And actually they treat images, videos, audio as indistinguishable from text or mechanically analogous to text. It's as easy for them to generate those. The key is they're non-direct physical interactions. Right. They're mediated over a distance through technology. And so, Turing is saying, I think we can get plausibly convincing text-based machines that are going to convince humans and that are designed to deceive, and that philosophically you can't think. What he hasn't quite anticipated is that they're then going to operate in the medium that will, in some sense, have replaced physical life for us.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, right? And this is, we move into a wholly new context in a certain way. And now the question, I think, will become, or one of the questions will become, does the introduction and the development of a radically different context for human interaction, what does that do to these age-old fears and desires that humans have had about the possibility of machine influence in their lives? Does it alter it? Does it just affirm right? The severity of these kinds of fears and desires, or does it do a little of both, right? Does it kind of pitch the fears and desires in slightly different directions while retaining the basic core, the basic emotional core of those things?
Yeah, absolutely. Was Turing a prophet? How much did he anticipate here? I mean, it's super interesting that he seems to have anticipated the chatbot, right? I mean, his whole thing is based around you go in another room and you just communicate through text. That seems pretty prescient. When he says these machines may well be, their inner workings are beyond the capacity, might have elements that are beyond the capacity of their engineers to themselves explain. That is my understanding of how people are feeling about some of the emergent properties of LLMs. Bit 2, Rossum. In the first part of the 20th century, work for many was transformed. Labor became the endless repetition of simple tasks. Armies of workers were fused with modern machinery to produce goods quickly and cheaply. Mass production became the central fact of contemporary existence. In the wake of the First World War, automaticity and homogeneity opened new vistas of abundance. This was Fordism, named after the automobile manufacturing techniques of the American Henry Ford.
Rossum's Universal Robots, a 1920 play by the Czech writer Karel Čapek, is the story of a Fordist factory where the product is people. More precisely, artificial people, maximally efficient at work, minimally problematic in their needs and wants. Čapek's play crystallized an imaginative relationship between artificial intelligence and the exploitation of labor, the reduction of the person to the productive function. To describe these manufactured workers, Čapek used the term robota, meaning forced labor. His play popularized the term robot, a machine with the appearance of a living creature capable of independent, complex action. The robots Čapek imagined looked like humans, but they're stronger and more intelligent. And they come without the emotional baggage, fears, the desires, and the dreams that humans drag along.
In the play, the manager of the robot factory says that, quote, a man is something that feels happy, plays the piano, likes going for a walk, and in fact does a whole lot of things that are unnecessary. But Rossum's robots only do necessary things. And so by eliminating the unnecessary, Rossum's factory, quote, rejected the man and created the robot, a mass-produced worker who works the Fordist assembly line. Alan Turing asked, do machines think? Karel Čapek wanted to know, do robots have a soul? To the bosses at Rossum, the answer is clear. When they make their robots, a soul is neither included nor an optional extra. Do-gooders visit the factory to proselytize to the robots about rights and freedoms. The bosses are unconcerned. The robots never react. After all, how could they? When they're not programmed to want the happiness and meaning that rights and freedoms are meant to bring. But surprisingly, there are signs that the machines are unhappy. Every now and again, the robots glitch. No one knows why. The factory employs a robot psychologist to investigate. Occasionally, he reports they seem to go off their heads, gnash their teeth, something like epilepsy. It's called robots cramp. They'll suddenly sling down everything they're holding, stand still, gnash their teeth. It's evidently some breakdown in the mechanism. Slowly, the robots seem to be changing.
A collision is coming. First, it is the human workers of the world who rebel against their robot replacements. World elites try to protect the robots from sabotage. They are expensive pieces of equipment. Robots are then given guns to defend themselves. Meanwhile, the robots form a union. They now have class consciousness and a lot of guns. Stephen and I wanted to think carefully about Rossum's Universal Robots, commonly referred to as RUR, as a foundational text in our thinking about artificial intelligence. We start with one of the key early plot points, as the humanitarian Helena Glory arrives at Rossum's Universal Robots, keen to spread the gospel of human rights.
And it turns out she's the representative of something called the Humanity League, which is this sort of humanitarian organization. And she's, rather crucially, the word Humanity League is quite important here because she is concerned with the human rights, quote unquote, of these artificial persons, these robota, these serfs, these slaves, however we're translating that word. And that sets in motion a series of events. And I don't think it's can you spoil something from over 100 years ago? I think we're going to have to run that risk. Yeah. What happens is it turns out there is a sort of revolution going on internally to the robots, where they're becoming more and more kind of conscious of their sort of place in the world. She has some role in kind of forwarding their conscience and their consciousness, and trying to sort of make the argument that they should be accorded more rights. And anyone who has seen any of the numerous works that RUR is clearly, Rossum's Universal Robots, is clearly in the background of and clearly inspired, like Blade Runner, Terminator, Battlestar Galactica, A Million, iRobot. Anyone who's seen any of those works can kind of figure out what's going to happen once these robots, once the robots' increasing understanding of their underprivileged position, and their increasing sort of acquisition of faculties that are more and more human, collides with the different goals of their human owners and those humans who are trying to advocate for rights. There's obviously a collision coming.
There is a collision coming. It's also, I think, important for us to note that these robots have been designed with a critically important distinction from their human overlords and designers, which is that they've been designed without a soul.
Yeah.
So these are robots who have advanced intellectual capabilities, clearly have advanced technical and workmanship types of capabilities as well. It's work skill sort of abilities. But it had turned out that equipping these kinds of robots with a soul was just too difficult to do. And so the Rossum the Elder had sort of driven himself mad trying to figure out how to make essentially perfect replicas of humans in a kind of a godlike status. And Rossum the Younger, his son, was much more of an engineer. And so Rossum the Younger is portrayed as sort of approaching this problem of creating robots from the perspective of a technical how-to engineering problem, rather than from the pose of trying to imagine oneself or putting oneself in the place of God who makes life. And so what ends up happening over the course of the play is that it seems like sort of by stages that are sometimes obvious and sometimes unclear how this is happening, that these robots are gaining, it's not that they're gaining consciousness necessarily, at least as I read it, it's that they're gaining little bits of a soul and of emotionality. And in particular, one of the hinge points appears to be a point at which the designers of the robots decide to endow them with the ability to feel pain, which they had not yet. And this appears to be like the sort of the big hubristic mistake that the humans make, because it's exactly this endowing of the robots with a soul, with the full scope of emotionality that human beings have, and with critically the ability to feel pain. This appears to be the trigger that leads to the robot uprising and rebellion.
Yeah, and one of we've touched on a lot of points there that we're going to have to unpack here. But one of the key things I think that's going on in this text that's absolutely central to contemporary understandings or debates about artificial intelligence is this debate about the material and the ineffable, the thing that you can create and sort of pick apart and put back together, and the thing that is maybe the most important thing, but you can't actually point to where it exists or where it resides. And the question of the soul is the key point there, right? That at one point Helena says to Domin, who is the sort of manager of Rossum's Universal Robots, how do you know that they don't have a soul? Domin says, we can't mistreat them, they don't have a soul. And Helena says, how do you know they don't have a soul? And Domin says, have you ever looked inside a robot? And so what Domin's saying is, it's just like gears and mechanics and all the rest of it. Point to me where the soul is. Well, of course, you can rather crucially make the same argument about human beings. And this has been a massive contemporary debate in philosophy, in physiology and psychology, right? That at some level, what is a human being? It's just a set of kind of in a brain, just a set of electrical impulses, and you can point to the part of the brain that does one thing, the part of the brain that does another. But to suggest then that a human being was essentially equivalent to a constructed object It's just the construction materials will be slightly different. To some people, that's unbelievably blasphemous. I mean, almost literally in a religious sense. To all humanistic people, it seems a mechanical, reductionist view of what a human being is and what a human being's worth is. To AI engineers, this is actually as I understand it, this is actually a perfectly reasonable comparison, right? The one of the founding principles of artificial intelligence is what's called substrate independence. The notion that all thoughts are and all cognition is, and all impulses and desires and emotions and feelings are just information, and they're just transmitted by electrical impulses. And the substrate upon which those are based could be biological, as in human beings, or it could be mechanical or electrical, as in artificial intelligence. But ultimately, it doesn't make any difference. They're just parallel systems with arguably equal capabilities, and it's just an engineering problem to render one equivalent to another. And without understanding any of that technology, or without having direct experience of any of that technology, has rather prophesied or presaged one of the fundamental philosophical and technical debates about artificial intelligence today. Helena is treated by the Rossum bosses as someone who is confused, someone who doesn't understand the boundaries between the human and the artificial. But maybe she is not the one who is confused, because it is Rossum's processes that have inaugurated a wholesale boundary collapse between the human and the robot.
And we see this, I mean, the first act of the play in which Helena Glory comes and, arrives at the factory. The entire first act is this series of confusions that she is portrayed as having, with an inability to distinguish, first of all, who is a robot, and then so she initially confuses robots for humans, but then later she confuses humans for robots.
Right.
And it turns out that the entire play ends up being this sort of identity confusion, or this collapse of boundaries between the human and the inhuman. And although we've been promised at the outset that the way that you distinguish between these two entities is that the one has a soul and a full emotional life and the other does not, it turns out that it is nowhere near that simple to put that distinction into practice and to use it as a persuasive method for distinguishing the two entities from one another. So much so, I think, that it's not entirely clear at the end of the day that our main characters, Doman, the lead sort of manager of the factory, and Helena, it's not clear, I don't think, whether either of them are themselves human. Although we're supposed to be led to believe that that's true, I think there are lots of potential clues and hints that they might be robots as well. So there's this kind of massive boundary collapse and boundary confusion that is in many ways the primary theme of all of those later texts that you were referring to. Blade Runner, Battlestar Galactica, Terminator. Like, what is it that makes people people? And is it possible to distinguish that from a replica, or famously in Blade Runner, a replicant? Or does it even matter?
Right.
And one of the things I think that was really interesting about RUR is that I'm not sure that at the end of the play, I think we're left with the question of, does any of this matter?
Yeah,
does it actually even matter?
Yeah.
That you've got humans and robots, or are both human life and its robotic analog, are they both pointing towards apocalypse?
Right. Yes, sort of doubling and boundary collapse is absolutely crucial. I mean, rather importantly, these robots are not, although they work in a factory, and that leads you to think, well, they're just, here's the head and we screw it on, and that you open them up and they've got gears and wires and all the rest of it. They're organic beings, right? Like they're just artificially grown from some kind of goop that Rossum's great discovery was this kind of goop that would lead to life, which is, although RUR, I think, is an original, maybe the original AI rebellion text, that notion of creating artificial beings from organic goop is super old.
It goes.
Yeah.
Exactly. This is
weird alchemy, and
this goes back to the books of Genesis.
Yeah.
Or the book of Genesis and those multiple origin stories in the Christian Bible. This is God creating man and woman out of clay, or out of the earth. This is God creating woman out of the rib of Adam. This goes back to other traditions as well. This is the gods creating human beings out of clay. Right. There are tons of Native American origin stories in which animals create human beings in the same way, out of straw and clay and dirt. The artificial creation of humanity and the consequences of so doing are a concern that is as old as recorded human history.
Yeah. And this kind of mistaking robots for people and people for robots that Helena goes through in the first sort of act of the play, it's played at the time as sort of a comedy, right? It's essentially a farce. Oh, you thought I was a robot and I'm actually a person. But it's a really profound sort of philosophical point. And I think it might be the key to the whole play, because the way that the play goes, and I'm going here off your comments that does it really matter at the end of the day who's the robot and who's the human? The play ends with two robots who are amongst the last living things on Earth, right? The humans are all done for by the robots doing the humans. And then the robots themselves find, well, we've actually destroyed our own ability to, we can't procreate, and we've killed all the humans who might be able to tell us.
And the robots wear out.
And they wear out, so they're all dying off. So there's very few people, there's maybe one person and two robots, or a lot of robots left, but two primary robots are left who fall in love with each other, right? And that's demonstrated by their willingness to kind of sacrifice each for the other. And they're explicitly referred to in the last lines of the play as Adam and Eve, a new Adam and a new Eve, And I think it's perfectly possible to read this play as a sort of retelling of the Genesis story. I mean, clearly that's what's going on. But also, who is to say that this is not, that this is the first cycle? It really seemed cyclical to me. And this is something that was the end of Battlestar Galactica, for example. The big revelation at the end of Battlestar Galactica is actually the created beings were themselves our ancestors on our Earth, and were constantly just living this cycle of the creation of life from artificial to organic, but at some point that distinction just doesn't matter anymore. I mean, what you're left with the play is the notion that Primus and Helena, the two robots, are going to go off and repropagate the species, and surely at some point they would stop thinking of themselves as secondary or artificial creations. They are in fact the natural and proper creations.
Rossum's Universal Robots is patient zero for contemporary thinking about the AI alignment problem. The fear that we won't be able to keep an artificial superintelligence aligned with our values. As the creations become smarter and more capable than us, they might decide they don't need us anymore. But RUR not only thinks forward, it's an encapsulation of the ideologies of the early 20th century. The play dramatizes how people were thinking about the biggest questions of national, economic, and social organization. In so doing, maybe RUR turns the alignment problem on its head. The obvious self-destructive tendency is to create artificial life, but to do it in a way that's haphazard or unclear, and which then escapes the command and control of the human creators.
Which is the contemporary fear of AI, right? The
exactly.
Problem.
But it turns out there are lots of other self-destructive tendencies embedded in this play as well. This is a play that has a lot to say about the self-destructive tendencies of capitalism, for example. And particularly advanced capitalism, which, as you might want to talk about, is frequently organized according to these Fordist logics of production. It also, it seems to me, is a story about the potential self-destructiveness of a kind of a nationalistic organization of the geopolitical system. And it harkens back as well to the sort of self-destructive tendencies of people who imagine themselves as lighting out into some unoccupied space or lesser occupied space and trying to remake a kind of a community there. So you've got these, it's almost like the cycle of self-destruction is layered at multiple points with a whole bunch of potential different impulses, which just leads us to believe that in the end, the new Adam and Eve will likely themselves find some self-destructive set of capabilities to engage in just keeps the whole thing going.
So I think that's an absolutely crucial point for thinking about the AI alignment problem, right? The AI alignment problem is commonly portrayed as the difficulty of creating something that's super capable, an artificial intelligence, and keeping it aligned with human goals so it doesn't go off on its own and ultimately like kill us all. Well, in RUR, the sin of humanity is not really the creation of artificial life. It's all the other thought constructs that are prevalent in 1920 when Capek's writing this play, right? So Fordism and the assembly line, right? The reduction of humans to pure labor with that are just functionally utilitarian, almost literally cogs in a wheel.
Cogs in a wheel, routinized roles.
Right.
You stand at the assembly line and you do a single job over and over.
And that's your life. That is the value of your life, and the boundaries of your existence as recognized by your employer and by extension the state and the community is your capacity to do this boring, repetitious job. Capitalism more broadly, that the robots are being bought and sold. I mean, that's how the play opens, right? Is Dorman is dealing with problems in delivering robots and some new orders that are coming in and just buying and selling of labor.
They've overproduced.
Yeah.
In the same way, right, that, for example, the kind of classic Marxist critique of capitalism, which is this just kind of unrelenting tendency towards overproduction, which ends up being, famously in Marxist phraseology, it means that capitalism ends up being its own gravedigger.
Yeah.
We see that here as well.
Yeah.
They're making way too many of these robots.
Yeah.
They don't have anywhere near the market that could satisfy this sort of supply. And it's precisely because they've overproduced so much that humanity gets wiped out so easily when the robots do engage in rebellion.
Right. And they're able to overproduce because they're using hyper-efficient Fordist principles, which are very good at producing stuff, but less good at cultivating kind of sensible, sustainable, long-term strategies of existing within the world. Atheism is sort of indicted, right? Rossum the Older is portrayed as solely and purely motivated by a desire to prove either that God doesn't exist or that God has been supplanted or is irrelevant, right? Because now I can create life, so what have you got to do with it, God? That's indicted.
Yeah, there's that hubristic element.
Absolutely.
He imagines himself and creates the scenario under which he himself can be the creator of life.
Nationalisms, there's a lot of talk about, it's clearly the island exists sort of out of time and space, but the only part of the outside world with which it interacts is a Europe that is riven by war and by nationalisms and militarism.
And the play is written in 1920, at
right.
the very end of what was then by a category difference, the most catastrophic set of armed conflicts in human history.
Right.
And so you've already got this overwhelming kind of despair that's floating in the air and this sense of apocalypse because, in fact, vast stretches of the globe were sort of apocalyptically rendered as a result of nationalistic folly.
Yep. And then you've also got humanitarianism or what you'd call in international relations like idealism. This notion of sort of universal human rights, but that is portrayed in the play and is embodied by Helena Glory as it's essentially like super naive, a bit flighty. I mean, this is a person who arrives on the island seeking to free the robots, and then within about 10 minutes has decided to marry the factory owner, and then that's kind of to the wayside. And then she does a series of things in secret that are sort of apocalyptic, which is the classic critique of idealism.
Right, and isn't that naivete? Isn't that the charge against Woodrow Wilson's effort? Yeah. At the League of Nations, for example.
100%. That's always the dichotomy that set up the realists and the idealists. And the idealists have good intentions, but bring about the apocalypse because their intentions are sort of totally unrealistic about the way that the world operates. And all of these things are central ideologies that are circulating in the first half of the 20th century, particularly when this play is written. And it's these ideological systems that are humanity's sin, not necessarily the creation of artificial life. And what they mean is that when artificial life is created, it's going to be created or polluted but by these human systems. And it's these human systems of thought, as they are reproduced in the robots, that bring about the apocalypse.
Right. It's the materiality of the robots and of the human drive towards creation and production exists within this series of contexts. It exists within an already constructed world, according to a whole series of modes of thought and practice. And so the play, I think, is sharp, as are a lot of our fictional accounts of what happens when humans innovate technologically. The play is really sharp, and these texts are really sharp on insisting that technology does not exist in a vacuum. It does not exist time out of mind. It is created by embodied historical, cultural people who are embedded within particular contexts. And so it is very natural to understand that the technological decisions are going to also share, or at least display the evidence of the times and the peoples who make them.
And so the alignment problem, which is seen as aligning AI with our values, well, actually, that if you solve that problem, that's arguably a bigger problem. That's what RUR is saying. Like, the most terrible thing would be to create even more capable beings that actually think like us and act like us, because we think and act in stupid, self-destructive ways.
And so maybe the way to think about this is not how do we align AI with our values, but how do we align our values with the AI?
Bit 3. Slaves. Rossum's robots were born into forced labor. Treated as slaves, they rebelled and took over the world. This narrative, the robot as slave and the slave's eventual revolt, is a staple of stories about AI. But can it help us to understand the real-world dilemmas we'll face as AI and robotics grows ever more advanced? We wanted to talk to an expert about whether the robot as slave was a good metaphor for thinking about AI. Dexter Gabriel is a professor of history at the University of Connecticut. We thought he was the perfect person to talk to about this, because not only does he study the history of slavery and emancipation, he studies how these histories make their ways into popular culture. So the robot as slave, owned, abused, often rebellious, is a theme that has a long history in popular culture. Popular culture depictions of artificial intelligence, especially in speculative fiction. What do you think of this use of the idea of slavery?
Yeah, I mean, it's old, as you pointed out, right? I was going to say people need to be careful, but it's already, that ship has sailed. It's been done so many times, right? Where mankind creates this sentient being, and then the sentient being engages, is used, and then realizes, hey, I'm being used, and rebels. Of course, I think we know our Asimov stories, but also in The Matrix, right? If nobody ever watched the Animatrix, which you're supposed to watch to be able to get how all the 8 Matrix movies fit together. It's that in between the first and the second. They tell you how everything came to be, and it's supposedly that mankind created these creatures, these sentient beings, and basically had them as their labor force. And then one of them, the BI-66ER unit, which is basically, if you didn't get that, it's a nod to Bigger Thomas from Native Son. He's about to be shut down. He does not want to be shut down, and so he kills his owners. After this, he's put on trial. It's like Bigger Thomas. There's a huge Million Machine March. I mean, the Wachowskis were not being subtle here. They were laying it on thick about what they were talking about. They had read, of course, Cornel West. I can't remember what work they read by him, but that's why he's in the second movie. They're very influenced. And so this is how the machine war starts, right? Where humanity cannot live alongside these beings they've created and enslaved. And in many ways, the machine rebellion is a slave rebellion, right? Against their former creators and owners. And so, I think you see this constantly in science fiction. I suppose the most recent is like The Creator, where this is also a film where artificial intelligence has risen beyond, and those fears. I guess it's part of that human fear, first of all, right? That you're going to create something like man, get Frank Herbert here, Butler and Jihad, same thing, right? Machines end up enslaving mankind. And there's this notion that these things we create might end up turning the tables and basically, turning us into their workforce or trying to destroy us. But yeah, there's definitely, I think it's almost natural that people think of slavery in that sense. You have these beings for labor. And so, yeah, there's constantly a slavery metaphor in there. Is it a useful metaphor? It's complicated. Whenever you try to do those kind of metaphors, whether it's turning, Black people and gay people into mutants, or gay people into vampires or True Blood, you're always going to have a problem there, right? I think we were talking about Star Wars, for instance, where the droids are droid army, but it turned out that the droids had done something bad, which is why people dislike them, right? And so, mutants do have powers, and that's why people may fear them. Vampires eat people. And so whenever you try to put these science fiction metaphors directly on historical slavery or historical people who have been marginalized, it can get problematic. I don't think it can't be done, but I think you have to be careful about it. But I think it says something about, our fears of slave rebellion, our fears that these creatures that we exploit may turn the tables on us. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Much as I suppose remember can say every alien invasion story, is their fears of colonialism.
Gabriel told us that movies that explore the historical experience of slavery don't give us much of an insight into the subjective experience of the enslaved. But when slavery is used metaphorically in AI stories, we tend to get much more of an insight into the inner life of the enslaved being.
And then it goes into who you're rooting for, right? And I'm thinking about like the older movies, like when Planet of the Apes, right? Just while we're in sci-fi here, came out in, the 1960s, 70s, there were stories about Black power figures who would go in and they'd root for the apes, right? They'd be like, yeah, you get Charlton Heston, right? They'd go in because they saw this as an idea of the power being, the apes themselves representing this attack against the establishment and the established power structure. And they saw it within these very different themes, right? That people may see them. And so, I do wonder, I remember people were watching some of the animatrix. They're like, are we supposed to be rooting for the machines or the humans anymore? I'm not certain, right? Who exactly side am I on? The same with the X-Men, right? We've been waiting for the mutants now, like the more recent cartoon that has a much more militant, I would say, X-Men ideology. People are like, I think I'm cool with Magneto now. I think Magneto is right, as the saying goes, right? And so, yeah, I think the analogy is interesting because for us, it allows us to explore those fears, but I don't know that it tells us much more other than maybe, hey, maybe you should think about that sentient being that you have, that once you have a sentient being who can think like you, perhaps we need to start thinking about what rights may they have. And that becomes a problem, I think, for people to have.
The computer scientist Joanna Bryson uses blunt logic to think about this issue. In her provocative paper, Robots Should Be Slaves, Bryson argues that we should give almost no moral consideration to robots. They are tools to be used, owned, and disposed of as we please. Jeff and I chewed over her argument. Joanna Bryson's paper, Robots Should Be Slaves, is a provocative argument about robot rights. And this is a widespread and ongoing debate, both within the community of kind of computer scientists and computer engineers and beyond. I wanted to start, Jeff, by just putting Bryson's thesis on the table with just a couple of quotes to kind of get everyone oriented here. So Joanna Bryson writes, quote, "Robots should not be described as persons, nor given legal nor moral responsibility for their actions. Robots are fully owned by us. We determine their goals and behavior, either directly or indirectly through specifying their intelligence or how their intelligence is acquired. In humanizing them, we not only further dehumanize real people, but also encourage poor human decision-making in the allocation of resources and responsibility. Therefore," she writes, "my thesis is that robots should be built, marketed, and considered legally as slaves, not companion peers." There's another quote I want to come to in a minute here, but I did want to get your sort of initial reaction to that thesis statement.
Yeah, so it's definitely a provocative thesis statement. And as we are considering it, I do think it's worth noting that there's a real disjuncture from the beginning of the thesis to the end of the thesis, and one that maybe sets up the provocative character of the thesis, but I think is maybe worth trying to disentangle a little bit. The first bit of the thesis, as you read, robots should not be described as persons, nor given legal nor moral responsibility for their actions. The final sentence of the thesis is, however, that robots should be built, marketed, and considered legally as slaves, not companion peers. Now, the problem potentially with crafting a thesis that has those two bookends is that describing, marketing, building, and considering robots as slaves imports the concept of personhood into it in the concept and in the figure of the slave. So if they ought not be described as persons, a reader might fairly ask, then why are we encouraged to describe them as slaves?
Yeah, there's lots of other words that could have gone in place of slaves that would not have the historical, emotional, moral, connotations or weight or baggage. So in other words, could be like tools.
Sure. Yeah. Well, just conceptually, what happens when you rely upon the figure of the slave is that you import into this discussion the human. You do it through a degraded class of people, but personhood is nevertheless imported into the overall discussion, which is strange when the very first lines of the thesis are that robots should not be described as persons. And I think you're right. By slave, I think probably Bryson wants us to think more in the register of things, so tools, objects, like a hammer, right? Or a screwdriver that you might use to do a specific kind of job.
Bryson's rhetoric is incendiary, but she does tee up a vital debate. How will we conduct our relationships with ever more capable AI?
I think more broadly than this, or I wonder if we might consider Bryson's paper more broadly than this as one position in a wider debate about robot rights, and a position that's maybe not that extreme in how it's stated when you unpack the position, but definitely comes off very extreme in its provocative first statements. But there are wider questions here that are general and maybe go beyond this specific paper. There's widely considered to be sort of two questions when you come to this notion of AI ethics in terms of how we are likely to humanize, a non-human thing and what rights we're going to accord it. There's what rights does the robot merit or deserve? So some properties of the created thing itself. And then there's the other side of the equation, which is how are we likely to treat them, or what rights are we likely to want to accord them, given who we are as humans and given our historical behavior in perhaps analogous situations.
Yeah, for sure. And at root, this is ultimately a question of how it is that we understand the boundary between rights and rightslessness. What is the dividing line, if any, that allows us to comfortably characterize an entity as either being a rights-bearing entity or one that is inappropriate for rights? And that dividing line, that distinction line between things that have rights, people that have rights, objects that have rights, and those that don't, is a story and a controversy in many ways that's as old as the concept of human rights itself. It is one of the through lines of the development of a kind of Enlightenment era understanding that human beings are invested with rights from some entity, whether it be a supernatural deist entity or whether it be just by virtue of being human. This discussion about who is entitled to rights and who is not, what are entitled to rights, what are not, is in some ways it's the beating heart of the question of rights itself. This attempt to demarcate a space in which particular things are rights-based and understood as properly rights-based and therefore have some sense of protection against particular activities or have some claim on perhaps a particular set of resources or capacities that someone or something that lacks rights would not have. And so we have seen over the course of the last couple hundred years of thinking about rights, we've seen a kind of a gradual expansion of the category of who and what are properly understood as rights-bearing entities. So much so that a great part of the early part of the American environmentalist movement from the 1960s and 1970s was that the argument, the politics of this really did take place on the terrain of whether things like rivers and streams and trees should be understood as rights-bearing entities, right? And so there's a certain way in which this entire discussion unfolds against the backdrop of trying to make sense of, is it proper to demarcate between things that are rightsless or have rights? Is that even a proper demarcation in the first place? But maybe what does it say about us that we are so constantly looking to draw dividing lines between things that have rights and the things that don't have rights. And so there's a certain way in which the robot discussion fits very neatly into a set of human disagreements and high-end discussions, philosophical and practical, about the concept of rights itself.
Yeah, and it's brought to a particularly acute point by the robot discussion, because that sort of originates, in or seems to originate in questions of kind of technology and construction. Mm-hmm. And so some of the ways we're used to thinking about what would constitute like fundamental advances in robot technology or artificial intelligence are sort of objective bars that would be crossed, like technological or engineering achievements. The robot can do X or has achieved X level of complexity in whatever it is, physical, movement or information processing. And therefore it jumps categories from this one thing to this other thing, in the same way that a car that goes 100 miles an hour is objectively, twice as fast as a car that goes 50 miles an hour. But when you're in the realm of rights and dignity and all the rest of it, these are not and have never been kind of objective standards, right? That there's never been an obvious thing that a person or a set of people or a non-human thing can do or achieves, and therefore they by definition move into that rights-bearing category. Or at least the thing that's specified in any community at any one point in time is community and time specific, right? It's a moving target, which means, it's a long-winded way of saying that this shows how important it is that non-technically minded people participate in this discussion, right? This has to be a humanities or a social science type discussion, because the technical capacities of the non-human thing are not going to answer that question.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, it's another way of saying that Bryson is on firm footing when she employs the concept, she's on firm historical footing, I should say, when she employs the concept of slave in order to be the marker of rightslessness. Because that is how, and to the extent in the modern history of human rights, that has been the way to deny the most obvious and well-established, most common way to deny rights to actual people is to deny them the capacities of personhood, to insist that they are not the same kind of people, or their humanity doesn't rise to the same level as others do, and so that they are therefore outside of the category of rights. So she's on firm historical footing, which is a different question about whether she's on firm ethical footing in employing the concept of slavery to deny something rights, to degrade its personhood to such an extent that they would be widely understood to be not appropriate subjects for rights.
Yeah. So, Jeff, I think it's important to recognize that Bryson's not saying, as I read her, that we should enslave robots that are like people. Right. In fact, she's very explicitly saying, I'm absolutely not arguing this. Mm-hmm. She's saying we should not build robots that could conceivably be accorded personhood or mistaken for people. Right. And we should be very clear, given the human tendency to attribute, to anthropomorphize non-human things, we should make it as clear as possible, both directly to people who do that and by way of designing robots that don't appear to be people. We should make very clear these are not people and they don't have the attributes of people. As we finish this first part of our journey, we find that we've generated more questions than answers. Here's a bit of what's bugging us. How will conversational AI reshape companionship and loneliness? Can or should you fall in love with ChatGPT? Do AI discourses and algorithms render us less free in work, love, politics? And how do these things affect our grasp on information and misinformation? How do popular cultural representations of AI offer possibilities and provocations? And how do these popular depictions map onto the predictions of AI experts? We'll be back soon to let you know how we're getting on.
You can find links in the show notes to extended versions of some of the discussions that we've had on these issues, as well as further discussion questions. In the meantime, please like and subscribe for more stuff like this.